Chapter 10. The long hours of waiting had blurred Doc's perception of time. Fear often clogged his throat, leaving him gasping for air and yearning to scream and break free from his cell walls. Yet there were also moments when nothing seemed to matter except the villages and the plague. The papers they brought him painted him as a monster, worse than Jack the Ripper or Albrecht Dellier. They were trying to focus all fear and resentment on him, and it seemed to be working. Crowds outside the jail screamed with hatred, their noise echoing even through the thin atmosphere of Mars. But there were also signs that the lobby was worried, as if they feared someone might attempt to rescue him. Doc had hoped that the trip to the airport would give him a sense of public reaction, but the lobby had no intention of testing that. Instead, the guards led him to the roof of the jail, where a small Northport-Southport shuttle was waiting. The landing space was too small for a station shuttle, but it was clear that the pilot was not happy about the extra weight. He muttered under his breath as the guards locked Doc's legs to a seat and left. Stan, carrying an official automatic, was waiting inside the shuttle. The young pilot looked nervous and unhappy, loaded with every drop of fuel the shuttle could hold. "Up ship," Stan ordered, ignoring the pilot's protests about being overweight. The shuttle lifted sluggishly, but there was no great difficulty. Doc could see that there was still some fuel remaining when they slipped into the tube at the orbital station. Stan went out, and other guards came in to free Doc. "So long, Dr. Miley," the pilot called softly as they led him out. 15 minutes later, he was locked into one of the cabins of the Iroquois, with all his possessions stacked beside him. With a wry grin, the honest worker on the Navajo remembered how he was treated like an animal. Now, as a human fiend, he luxuriated in a cabin of the finest ship of the fleet, with constant spin to give a sense of weight and more room than the entire tube crew had ever known. He wandered around the cabin until he found a collapsible table and set up the electron microscope on it, feeling it was a shame that such good equipment would be wasted along with his life. He wondered if they would really throw it out into space with him, which they probably would. He pressed a button on the call board over the table and asked for the steward. There was a long wait, as if the procedure were being checked with some authority, but finally he received a surly acknowledgement. "Steward, what you want?" "How's the chance of getting some food?" "You're on first class." They could afford it, Doc decided. He wouldn't cost them much, considering the distance he was going. "Bring me 2 completed dinners, 1 Earth normal and 1 Mars normal." "Okay, Miley, but if you think you can suicide that way, you're wrong. You may be sick, but you'll be alive when they dump you." A sharp click interrupted him. "That's enough, steward. Captain Everett speaking. Dr. Miley, you have my apologies. Until you reach your destination, you are my passenger and entitled to every consideration of any other passenger except freedom of movement through the ship. I am always available for legitimate complaints." Miley shook his head. He'd heard of such men, but he'd thought the species was extinct. The steward brought his food in a thoroughly chastened manner. He managed to find space for it and came to attention. "Is that all, sir?" For a moment, as the smell of real steak reached him, Doc regretted that his metabolism had been switched. Then he shrugged. A little wouldn't hurt him, though there was no proper nourishment in it. He squeezed some of the gravy and bits of meat into one of his bottles, sticking to his purpose. Then he dug into the rest. But after a few bites, it was queerly unsatisfactory. The seemingly unappealing Mars normal ragu suited his current tastes better, after all. Once the steward had cleared away the dishes, Doc got to work. It was better than wasting his time in dread. He might even be able to leave some notes behind. A gong sounded, and a red light warned him that acceleration was due. He finished with his bottles, put them into the incubator, and piled into his bunk, swallowing one of the tablets of morphital the ship furnished. Acceleration had ended, and a simple breakfast was waiting when he awoke. There was also a red flashing light over the call board. He flipped the switch while reaching for the coffee. "Captain Everett," the speaker said, "may I join you in your cabin?" "Come ahead," Miley invited. He cut off the switch and glanced at the clock on the wall. There were less than 11 hours left to him. Everts was a trim man of 40, erect but not rigid. There was neither friendliness nor hostility in his glance. The man known as Doc gestured towards the breakfast tray, his words polite. "Thank you, but I've already eaten," he said. He took a seat, and the conversation turned serious. "My wife is worried about the plague," the captain began. "There is unease even on Earth. The ship physician thinks she may have it, but isn't sure of the symptoms. I hear you're an expert." Doc wondered about the physician, but knew there was no harm in listening. "When did she have Selznick's migraine?" he asked. "About 13 years ago," the captain replied. "We went through it together, shortly after our metabolism was switched during the food shortage of '88. Doc examined the base of the captain's skull and found the swelling. "Both of you must have it, Captain, though it won't mature for another year. I'm sorry." "Is there no hope?" the captain asked. Doc studied the man and saw that he was not the type to bargain for his life. "Nothing that I've found, Captain. I have a clue, but I'm still working on it. Perhaps if I could leave a few notes for your physician." But the captain shook his head. "I'm sorry, Dr. Miley. I have orders to burn out your cabin when you leave. But thank you." And with that, he left. Doc tore up his notes in frustration and paced his cabin, watching the hours tick by. He knew the fear was growing in him, but he pushed it aside. With half an hour left, he began making his films. 3 men entered the room, one holding out a spacesuit. The other 2 gathered up everything in the cabin and stowed it in a protective sack. Doc climbed into the suit, and they marched him down the hallway to meet the captain. With 3 minutes left, they reached the airlock. The spacesuited man climbed in and began strapping down. Doc saved one brachyweed and raised it to his lips, fumbling for a light. The captain stepped forward and flipped a lighter, and Doc inhaled deeply. The fear was palpable, and Captain Everts craved a smoke to calm his nerves. But then he remembered where he was. "Better switch back to Earth normal metabolism, Captain," he told himself, surprised at how normal his voice sounded. Everts's eyes widened briefly, and he gave a small bow. "Thank you, Dr. Miley." It was absurd, impossible, but there was a strange comfort in the formality of it all. It was like a scene from a play, too surreal to affect his actual life. Everts nodded to the man holding his helmet, and Doc extinguished his brachyweed before the helmet snapped into place. Oxygen hissed into the suit, and it ballooned out without the pull of gravity. The 2 men handed him up easily to the one in the airlock, and the inner seal began to close. The big chronometer in the lock showed 10 seconds left. The spaceman used the time to tie Doc's possessions securely to his suit. A red light blinked on. The man caught Doc and held him against the outer seal. The red light blinked again. 4 seconds. 3, 2. Suddenly there was a heavy thudding sound, and the Iroquois lurched slightly. The spaceman's face registered surprise. The red light blinked and stayed on. 0! The outer seal snapped open, and the spaceman pushed Doc out. Air exploded outwards, and Doc drifted away from the ship, alone in space. Oxygen hissed softly through the valve, ticking away his life.